Hello, pequeños, and hello to those of you from the low desert. I see you, I know you're here, and I appreciate you being here to join us. Your input and your questions are just as valuable as anyone in the high desert. So glad to see you. So we're fully into spring now, and if you're anything like me, you're thinking ahead to the summer months, and you're kind of thinking back to last summer with the horrible weather that we had. It turns out that 105 degrees for 3 weeks straight is quite a bit outside of our norm. A lot of people saw their plants struggling. Either they just didn't grow or they didn't produce. There was a lot of trouble, especially with like tomatoes around July and the beginning of August. This is probably going to become more of our norm in the next 20 years. In fact, they are predicting that our weather patterns and our heat indexes are going to be closer to those of Tucson in the next 20 years. So buckle up, get ready, because this is going to be our future. So today I want to talk about what these weather changes are going to mean for your garden production, for your landscaping, and specifically we're going to talk about what that means in regards to your soil, because your soil is going to be your first line of defense. If you have good soil, you can maximize your water retention, you can reduce your wind and water erosion, and you can lower your soil temperatures, which will help immensely, and you can also improve your soil ecology. Now, we're going to be reviewing a little bit of what I talked about in my soil video, so if you haven't watched that one yet, please check it out. It will help kind of lay the groundwork for what I'll be talking about today. I'm going to still keep it simple, but it's going to be a little bit more in depth than the original video was. Today we'll be discussing low or no-till practices, why they're really effective for us here in the high desert or even the low desert, and why it might be the best change you can make to help you weather the weather. And stick around at the end because I will address the few times when tilling is absolutely essential and you absolutely have to do it. Welcome to High Desert Growing. I'm Jay Bell. Let's get started. Okay, first, no-till and low-till. What do these terms even mean? It means that we don't till or turn our soil, or we only turn small portions, and that's it. We don't turn it in the spring, we don't turn it in the fall, we never turn it really. It's a relatively recent development that really began in the 1960s, but it really began to pick up steam about 30 years ago, and it's really only begun to go mainstream in about 10, 15 years ago with farmers integrating it into the regenerative farming practices. But it can also be really effectively introduced and integrated into your backyard farms and gardens. Now, I want to give something of a heads up that does come as a package deal with bugs and weeds. You kind of have to change your mindset on that, and I think that rubs some people the wrong way. They really want a nice clean space. They want to have soil that they can see, and I get it, but that's not how nature designed soil and plants. And so if we want to mimic that as closely as we can, we have to kind of provide the same environment. And specifically, I've had a few people ask me over the years, a time or two, hey, Jay, I've been tilling my soil. My grandmother tilled her soil. Everything works, everything grows. Why should I change things? Why fix it if it ain't broke? That's a good question. We're going to talk about that today. Remember back in school when they talked about the evolution of human society and everything. So we started with like the Stone Age, and we went to the Iron Age, and then there was the agricultural revolution, and we had the plow. And the plow is really cool because now we can dig up big rocks with the help of animals and turn over really hard compacted soil and make it soft and pliable and usable for growing things. That enabled us to grow a lot more food with a lot less effort. Then comes the Victorian era, where there was a heavy focus on empirical sciences, hard data. We developed tractors and we tilled more soil than ever before. And then the drought hit in the 1930s, and coupled with the drama and tragedy and questionable financial practices of the Great Depression, we wound up with the Dust Bowl. So how does that happen? Like why, how? They don't really talk about that much in school, about the agricultural side of it. Millions of acres of formerly rich prairie soil suddenly reduced to a useless sandy desert, and all of that in less than 20 years. This applies to us specifically because we have that sandy soil to begin with. Today we know that soil is comprised of different levels or horizons. We have O, A, B, and C horizons, and there's some in between, but we're focusing on the simple ones. So without getting into much into the nitty-gritty of it, here's the gist. O is your surface layer, which is no more than like 2 inches deep, and it's basically your organic matter. It's where the frenzy feeding ground for most of the critters that keep your soil alive are. A is your topsoil that sits under the O horizon. This is where a lot of your root growth happens. It's just a really rich part of the soil. B horizon is typically minerals and clay, and it hosts some of your deeper ecosystem, maybe about 1 foot to 3 feet deep. Now, earthworms love this level, and then C horizon is going to be whatever your local base rock is in the region, which I think here is granite, but I'm not 100% sure, so maybe look that up if you're really curious. At this level, there's really little or no soil formation going on, so there's not a whole lot of life down that far. Now, bear in mind that these depths are just kind of approximations of, to give you a mental image or a mental visual of what's going on in your soil. And it might be very different. Like if you're up in the mountains, on the East Mountains, it's going to look different than it will down at the, the river basin right next to the river where it's had millennia to build up a really rich soil layer. It really gets super sciencey, but what I want you to do now is take a look at your arm. Okay, we kind of have the same thing going on with our skin, right? So we've got the epidermis, we've got the dermis, we've got the subdermal layers, and I'm not a doctor, but I'm pretty sure that each one of those layers has a very specific job at each of those very specific depths. Now take a moment and imagine going in with a plow and turning your skin inside out to help it out. It's kind of gross, I know, but that's basically what too much tillage can do. The soil is your garden skin, and when you till the soil, you're upending all of these very specific layers, and you're bringing the deepest members of your ecosystem to the surface, expecting them to survive in the harsh air and sunlight, and then you're burying the surface level critters who need lots of air, and then you smother them. So when you till, what you're doing is you're depleting your biggest helpers. Now let's take a moment and imagine that we've stopped tilling our soil and we've allowed it to build its own environment, and something really cool happens. Your ecosystem begins to build a super helper called fungus. Fungus is a must. A lot of you have probably heard the buzzwords, mycorrhizal fungi. So for those of you who haven't, mycorrhizae form a beneficial symbiotic relationship with plant roots. So they attach to plant roots and they increase the plant's potential for water and nutrient uptake. And in return, the plants feed the fungus the sugar it makes from the sun. It's a win-win for everyone. Fungus typically lives beneath the soil, and it's like a network of white spider webs. And the only time that you really know it's there is if it's happy enough to send up fruiting bodies, which, mushrooms, right? So now, quick disclaimer, please don't eat the mushrooms that you find in your garden unless you are an experienced mushroom hunter, because it can be dangerous. Now, back to our topic. When these fungi are allowed to grow undisturbed, they do a lot of amazing things. But today we're going to focus on soil structure and health specifically. When you have a healthy population of fungi and plant roots, they very literally tie the soil together, like tie it together. This creates what is called a soil sponge. It's got built-in air pockets to feed the roots oxygen, water pockets to keep the soil moist, and highways that make it easier for your critters and new roots to travel through. And because it's sponge-like, it's much better at recovering from compaction. Basically, if you step on tilled soil, you're crushing all of those delicate, necessary little pockets of air and water, and they don't come back. But in no-till or low-till soil, everything kind of springs back like a sponge and then preserves those necessary spaces. When we've got these superhighways built into our soil and all those roots and fungi are intertwined, something else happens too: communication. Plants can literally send signals through their roots, through the connecting fungi, and onto other plants several feet away or even yards away. And they might say something like, "Hey, I'm being eaten by a grasshopper, prepare your defenses." And the plant on the other side of the garden is able to do things like release chemicals that will attract the natural predator of the grasshopper. It kind of sounds like science fiction, but it's not. Nature's really just that crazy cool. So how long does it take for no-till to take effect? Well, I mean, immediately you begin to see effects, but it takes time to build ecology. I mean, anytime you've seen someone, rehabilitating an environment, it literally takes years, and it's really not a whole lot different in your garden or a farm. On average, a farmer has to wait 6 years or so to begin to see the benefits on their farm, and that's kind of part of the reason it's not a practice more widely adopted for industrial use. 6 years is a big hit to take financially, especially when you have to buy new, albeit smaller and lighter machines, and change over your entire system. Fortunately for us hobbyists and backyard growers and smaller scale growers, that's less of an issue. I don't need a tractor on my third of an acre. So now we understand the basics of soil structure, we're going to talk about bugs. Because when you live in the desert, you need all the help you can get, and accepting the bugs and the worms as part of the process is going to serve you the very best. Now, that doesn't mean that you accept the codling moths and the tomato hornworms. Absolutely you don't. You should definitely treat for those and remove them. But there is one thing that you can do for your garden that is super easy and absolutely delightful, and that's introducing predators. Now, that can be anything from ladybugs and lacewings all the way up to birds and inviting birds into your yard, and even in some cases, lizards and frogs. Also, bees and wasps, because they're not even just stingers, they're predators. There's a type of wasp, for example, that will lay its eggs in a tomato or tobacco hornworm, and when those eggs hatch, they kill the hornworm, and then you don't have to worry about it eating your tomatoes. That's a great critter to have in your garden. And on top of that, when they go from being larvae to being bees or wasps, you have an automatic built-in pollinator. They're fantastic. But really, if you can foster the birds in your yard, that is such a big part of our ecosystem. And it doesn't seem like a lot, but you bring in the birds, you provide the bugs because you're not spraying for them anymore, and now you have something of a balance going on that is in harmony with what's going on under the ground as well as on top of the ground. It can be as simple as putting out hummingbird feeders, because one of the things that hummingbirds absolutely love to snack on, mosquitoes, and we all have way too many of those. But once again, I want to stress the idea that for these predators to exist in your yard, there has to be food for them. That means having aphids in your yard. Now, don't let them destroy your plants. You can do all kinds of things like plant trap crops. I leave dandelions in my yard in my plantings so that the aphids go to that first. They love those dandelions. They eat the heck out of them, and they tend to leave everything else alone. And when I leave them alone, the ladybugs follow. And then pretty soon, I may have had a plant that was completely covered in aphids, and then a week or so later, it's completely covered in ladybugs, and there's almost no aphids to be found. You may ultimately want to stop using herbicides too, especially things like glyphosate or Roundup. In the United States, the government says that glyphosate is not harmful for humans, but we're the only country in the world that allows it still. Every other country in the nation has gotten rid of it. Not only just for human health hazards, but because yes, okay, you're spraying the things in your driveway. Maybe you're spraying all those little weeds. You spraying with glyphosate, done, no harm done, except that stuff lingers. Even if broken down, it lingers. And our first rainstorm, or maybe you hose down your driveway, all of that gets washed down into the city sewers. And then you wind up with these chemicals in our water treatment plant. And sometimes, not all of those get filtered out and they get released into the wild, and now they're in our river system. So it's important to pay attention to the chemicals we're using, because even a small amount that we don't think is going to have a big effect, a small amount from 100 houses is 100 times that amount. There's a lot of other options for you besides spraying them with chemicals that are manufactured. For example, you can introduce a weed that you prefer and
yes, we have to kind of get comfortable with the fact that there are going to be weeds. The difference is choosing the weeds that you find preferable. So I don't want silvery nightshade in my yard, but henbit sure likes to take over. It has pretty flowers and it's edible. Another option between my flagstone in my backyard, rather than dealing with all the other weeds, I let the purslane go hog wild. I love having purslane. For starters, it's edible, but also it doesn't require water, and it's so voracious it takes over. And then another option is allowing some of your herbs to become weeds. So I have parsley every year volunteering in different parts of my yard. I'm happy to have it. My dill takes over in random spots. That's great. If it's in a spot I don't like, I move it. But where I have these weeds, which really honestly is just a plant that we don't want in that spot, right? Having these weeds is better than having, say, tumbleweeds or maybe London Rocket. Some of you like that, some of you don't. But accepting that the earth is strong enough to support some plant life and not spraying the heck out of it to kill those plants so that nothing can grow there is a shift of paradigm and our expectation of the space that we live in that allows us to be better partners with the nature that we are living amongst. And that can only benefit our soil. And lastly, I'm going to wave the flag mulch again. And lastly, I'm going to wave the mulch flag again because yay, mulch! It does so much for our soil. It protects the roots from the sun. It protects our creepy crawlies from the sun and the wind. It keeps our soil from blowing away in the wind. It keeps the moisture in. That's a huge one right there. Keep the moisture into your soil. You are protecting your ecosystem and you are providing the nutrients for your plants because they can't pull them up unless there's water in there. It reduces the surface temperature of your soil by a lot. Now, 105-degree temperature outside in the air, ambient temperature, translates to something like 140, 130, 140 degrees surface temperature on the soil. So that mulch is a huge deal. And also if you can provide some kind of shade for your plants, like shade cloth, anywhere from 30 to 50% is probably ideal going forward in this season. So let's go back through everything we've just talked about and lay it all out in one sentence, basically. Okay, so no-till increases your water retention, sometimes by a huge amount, like 40 to 60%, depending on your soil. It improves your soil structure to help it resist compaction. So if it gets stepped on, you're not crushing out all the life from your soil. It ties everything together from roots. So kind of like knitting it together, literally, so that it doesn't blow away during windstorms or wash away during monsoon. Hopefully we get one this year. And when the water does come, hopefully from the monsoon, we're hoping for this year, it doesn't filter through the soil and take everything with it. In other words, if you run water through tilled soil versus water through non-tilled soil, the tilled soil is going to come out brown, like a yellow brown, because that's all of those nutrients and things washing out of the soil because they're not locked in. The non-tilled, the no-till soil is locked up, and all of those nutrients, for the most part, stay put. So the water that comes out of that is almost clear. So when you are using no-till practices, you are also putting less pollutants because yes, nutrients that we put into our soil, even if it's just fertilizer, are considered a pollutant, especially if there winds up to be too much of it in one spot. It can cause problems like algae blooms. So no-till helps to reduce that and increases the overall nutrient value of your soil, so it requires less input. And on top of all that, it requires less work, and so you're saving time and money and helping your plants to produce through the hottest parts of the year. So there's a lot of pros to no-till and not nearly as many for tilling. So back to the question of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? I'm not here to tell you what to do. Do whatever works for you. But if you are feeling up to the challenge of, making a change and living in better lockstep with the life outside your home and improving your water use, this may be a really important step to take. And so it kind of takes a leap of faith to jump in and give it a go. That said, I want to make it very clear that there are times when tilling is absolutely essential in our climate. So if you're going to start a garden for the very first time and you're putting in new landscape plants, you are going to need to dig up the sand and clay because it starts out compacted without any life for the most part and very few air pockets. You have to give that space to do what it's going to do. Now, if all you're going to do is going to be growing landscape plants that are native or naturalized, things like milkweed, desert 5 o'clocks, Russian sage, these things, all you need to do is turn the soil, loosen it in a wide radius around where you're planting, and then water for the first year. And for the most part, that should take care of it. If, however, you're making new soil for acid-loving plants like flowers, peppers, peas, you will need to dig up your sand and clay. You'll need to turn it over. You'll have to heavily amend it with organic matter and manure and maybe even coconut coir for some acidity. And then you need to treat it so that it can have some time to develop its ecology. You can speed that up by adding things like compost tea that are like rife with microbiology. Compost tea would be the equivalent of using something like kombucha for your stomach gut health, except that it's the same concept for your soil. You're adding the microbes to the soil so that they can spread and begin the ecology. When I did my father's-in-law garden several years ago, he had been trying to till the same stretch of sand literally with a rototiller for years and was just trying to grow in that and never had success. His plants always were puny and they had leaves, but they never produced flowers, so they never produced fruit because they were not healthy enough to go into the very energy intensive phase of making flowers so they could make fruit. When I did that process for him, I used this book as a resource and I found it to be really useful. And as always, I recommend this Down to Earth book put out by the Albuquerque Extension Master Gardeners. It's written specifically for our climate in and around Albuquerque by local gardeners, local master gardeners. You can find it at most of the nurseries. You can find it at the garden center. And the lasagna gardening book, I don't know if it's still in publication, but it was really, there's a lot of them for sale secondhand, so not very expensive. This is a lot of information to fit into a really tight space, but I really just wanted to lay out the basics in a very clear manner to help answer the questions that I get on a regular basis. Now, there is so much more to soil health than I can fit into this brief 20-minute video, but if you've got specific questions, please leave a comment. I do read every one, and I try to answer every question that I get. I hope that answers some of your questions. I hope that it at least inspires some ideas for you, or at least served to educate you in some way that you didn't have previously. That's all I've got for today, but keep an eye out for my next video because I will be doing a little tidbit on soil testing and, yes, why our climate makes that more difficult too. Take it easy, guys. Have a great spring. Hasta luego.